Great, thanks so much, Nick, and thanks to you and CITP for organizing this conference. This is a fantastic and very timely topic, I think. As Nick said, or he didn't say, but I'm a legal scholar by training. I spent some time working at the FCC and do a variety of technology policy-related work. And interconnection, for those of us in the telecommunications policy world, is a long-standing, incredibly central issue. It was, in fact, the fundamental issue that led to the regulation of AT&T going back to 1913, well before we even had a Federal Communications Commission. And then you talk about the internet world. I love to remind people that it's called an internet for the reason that fundamentally, at a technical level, it's all about interconnection. And for a long time in these policy debates that we would have, there wasn't a recognition of the importance of focusing in on interconnection in the internet. There was a sense that, well, it would just happen. And very clearly in the last few years, and Nick alluded to some of that in terms of some of the recent disputes, it's become a very central issue in the policy debate as well. And clearly it's one where the policymakers, the economists, the businesses, and the technologists need to come together. You can't understand interconnection just in one of those domains and get an accurate picture. So I think this is going to be a great day to try to look at where we are now, what are some of the issues, and dig a little bit deeper than what we've seen in some of the food fights that have been going on. And this research that Nick has just released is fantastic, and I think a great starting point for that. So on this panel, we've got three people. We're going to, I think, try to set the stage by talking about the evolution of interconnection and try to get some of the issues on the table. They're each going to give a short presentation, then we'll have some discussion. Hopefully we can quickly get all of you in the audience into the discussion as well. So let me just briefly give you their bios, and then I'll turn it over to them to start. To the immediate end of the table is Joe Hall, who's the Chief Technologist at Center for Democracy and Technology, which, for those of you who don't know, is one of the leading and most influential public advocacy groups that works on internet policy issues and has for a long time. He's also the head of their Internet Architecture project, which works on embedding human rights values into core internet standards and infrastructure. In the middle is Arpit Gupta, who's a PhD student here in CS at Princeton, works with Nick and Jennifer Rexford, focusing on the interconnection of internet routing and software-defined networks. And then immediately to my left, Jane Coffin, who's responsible for development strategy at the Internet Society, who works on expanding internet infrastructure access and capacities in emerging economies. So great range of perspectives here. I'm going to stop and turn it over to Joe first to give us a perspective on the evolution of interconnection, and then we'll go from there.
May the projection gods treat me well. Oh, there's more than one god. So anyway, my name's Joe Hall. I'm the Chief Technologist at CDT. It's actually kind of a weird title in that there's only two of us, so it's not a big deal. You know, those of you in this room have much more information about this than I am. I'm a relative dilettante to this area. Do we got projection? It'll happen. Anyway, so what I'm going to do is briefly give those of you in the room who may not know anything about interconnection some sort of a level set in terms of, there's my slides. Cool.
Okay, we can interconnect from there over to here, right?
Yeah. So we can't get them over here too? I mean, let me see if I can mirror my displays really quick. Sorry, everybody.
Yeah, it's coming. It's coming. It's warming up. It's coming up.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, then I'll just look over there. Okay, so you guys are going to be blinded. Apologies. Anyway, so I'm going to quickly just do a quick level set and discuss, some of the vocabulary you got to have to talk about interconnection, and then go into my organization's particular thoughts and issues related to surveillance in interconnection. So it's going to be kind of strange in that we're going to jump in with a quick tutorial-like presentation, and then go to sort of civil liberties and stuff pretty quickly. So it's kind of a mixed bag, but hey, well, that's what you get. What is going on? Oh, I'm still in launch bar. Die. There we go. Okay, so CDT, we're, as Kevin had said, a public advocacy organization. We do a lot of advocacy, a lot of research. We try and really connect expertise into the policy process so that people aren't making rules sort of in a vacuum, and they have grounded technical expertise to do that stuff. And similarly, bring to the technologists the things they need to know about how policy works and why they're a really important factor there. If you don't know a lot about interconnection, I have a feeling that that's like maybe 3 of you in the room today. You should definitely go check out this report that a number of us in the room worked on. BTAG, the Broadband Internet Technology Advisory Group, is a multi-stakeholder group of technologists on 5 areas. We have academic, civil society, content providers, ISPs, hardware makers, all sorts of stuff. We all get together and write these reports, and these reports are essentially, if you're a smart high school student, you should be able to start at the beginning, and if you can make it to the end, and we try to write them to where it's not too hard to make it to the end, you will know quite a bit about the given subject. And so myself and Jason Weil of TWC co-edited the BitTag report on interconnection, and the URL right there will get you right to the report. And so that report goes into a lot of detail and actually can teach you about some very zeroth and first order information about BGP and stuff like that a lot of folks who make rules about the internet may not even know exists in some cases. But to give you sort of an idea of how interconnection has evolved, the early internet looked a lot like this. This was something that I drafted alongside David Clark, and so David was saying, no, it looked like this, change it. And what you can see here is it's very hierarchical. You had the US government operating what was essentially a backbone at the very top, and you can think of the backbone as sort of the long distance calling equivalent of internet communication. It gets stuff over long distances. And everything sort of connected up through larger regional networks and from local networks, all through the backbone to get somewhere. So if you're going to send stuff, you had to go all the way back up and all the way back down. Later, the internet became commercialized, which meant that the government wasn't the only one and was increasingly not relevant in offering backbone provision. And so at the top you see there are commercial backbone providers that are connected to each other and sell as a service access to the rest of the internet. And so you can see here the backbone providers are selling access to the rest of the internet to large regional ISPs, and those in turn sell access up through their networks to the rest of the internet to their customers as well, all the way down. And here you start to see that we start to see something called peering. Essentially, the dotted lines here are sales relationships. I'm selling you access to the internet above me. And the one solid line, or there's a couple solid lines here you see, are peering relationships. Peering is this notion of, hey, I don't want to go through my transit provider to get to this part of the network because you're right there and we happen to be in the same data center. How about we just plug a cable in between our equipment? And it's obviously not that simple, but essentially that's what you do. And it basically, the peering relationships traditionally depend on somewhat symmetrical flows of traffic. It can be off by 2 to 1 and lately even bigger. Now, today, the internet looks very, very different in the sense that some of the regional ISPs have grown to be so big that they have elements of backbone provision in them. You see that in the left with the national ISP. You see backbone providers selling transit to smaller entities. You see regional ISPs starting to peer themselves when they realize that they don't need to pay transit if they can just ink these relationships and set up the equipment between 2 facilities. And you also start to see the rise of CDNs, content distribution networks, essentially bringing content closer to the eyeballs, closer to the edges of the networks. And those can be either equipment housed near or within a given network. And you'll hear those of us talk about networks as autonomous systems. Just think of the name autonomous system as a much more formal definition of a network. Anyway, so these things can be inside. And also you see content distribution networks peering themselves and also buying transit and things like that to get their bits as close as they can to the edges of the networks. And you see much more peering here, and this is where we start to get in the tussles related to, are you a peer or should you be a customer of mine? And if you're a BGP transit customer of mine and we peer, are we going to have weird relationships where you're sending traffic to me through a peering connection and I end up sending traffic back down to you through a transit line or something like that? You get weird asymmetries that can happen. But anyway, so how do you actually interconnect? You have to do at least two things. You have to actually have a physical connection. And so a lot of folks will, originally you had network access points, which are now known as internet exchange points. Essentially a data center. You can see that on the left here, you have a co-location facility, a bunch of servers, 1, 2, 3, 4, from different network providers. AS1 is Autonomous System 1, the one network. And they have cables that essentially connect between the different networks. This is sort of how it has been for a while. Increasingly on the right, you see the rise of an internet exchange, where instead of having to engineer connections one-to-one to any given other provider in that facility, you plug it into basically a big switch, a big thing that allows you to plug it into one place, and then you can set up the logical connection, the next piece that I'll talk about, from a fabric of the actual technical connection. So it's not just necessarily a bunch of one-on-one cables, but plugging into sort of a generic thing. And obviously some of you know way more about this than I do, but some of you don't. Anyway, and so once you have the logical connection set up, once you have the physical cable connection set up, you have to have a logical connection. You have to actually, it's not just like a mechanical thing like water, where once you have the pipes and you turn the switch, everything sort of flows, and if you have leaks and stuff, you can deal with that. You actually have to, when packets need to be routed in a network, the first thing that the network asks is that within my own network or is it within another? If it's within my own network, I can take care of that. If it's within another, I need to know where to throw those packets to get to the eventual destination. And so you can see here on the left, if the customer, so you have route announcements, these things basically saying, hey, here are the IP addresses or the destinations I have within my network. And those get aggregated up through transit providers. And you can see that this customer may, sending traffic up to its provider, that AS cloud right there, it may be trying to go to I should have numbered these, the tiny little cloud on the left, or maybe trying to go to another customer of their provider. And so when they send traffic up, they may know, well, geez, it's not on my network and I'm buying internet access from somebody, so I'll send all my packets up to my provider, and then that provider will send it saying, hey, I know this chunk of the internet's in this way, this chunk of the internet's that way, on this link or this link, and they'll send it across those links to get to where they need to. BGP, the Border Gateway Protocol, is what allows you to do these route announcements to basically say, here's the part of the internet I'm responsible for, send me traffic here. Anyway, so it's a very toy example there. So to sort of shift gears here, please read that full report if you need to know more about interconnection. That was a very, very quick and a very misenunciated overview of the interconnection. Something that we worry about a lot in civil society are how the technical fabric can be changed to essentially accomplish what I would call a legal hack, a way of routing traffic so that it becomes legally protected differently. When traffic crosses national borders, serious things can happen. There are a couple of, at least in the US and other countries have the same things, there's a couple of legal authorities that reduce the amount of protection that traffic receives simply because it's crossed a border. So for example, in the United States, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, Section 702, essentially allows the NSA and the intelligence community to collect data from communications where one end is foreign. So if you see something crossing a border, or if the communication is taking place entirely between systems that are not on US soil, they can be very promiscuous with the data they collect, including not just metadata, but full take content data. And so we've already seen some of this stuff. Unfortunately, adversarial route announcements, which I know may be a thing. There's a big debate about can you, as I'll talk about with a case here in a sec, But if you can accomplish a route announcement that reroutes traffic for a period of time across a national border and do it in a way that it's targeted at somebody that you'd like to collect information from, that removes essentially all the due process and all the other kinds of legal oversight that we have here in the United States. No warrant required. This is intelligence collection. And we've actually seen some of this stuff. So for example, this is one that I know is kind of controversial, but the Dine guys and Renesas described this one case where there was a traffic from one side of Denver to another side of Denver for about an hour was rerouted through Iceland. And that is exceedingly a strange case. You see this like in Toronto and Chicago, you'll see stuff flying across the borders or in places where you can kind of intuitively feel that the network topography could be kind of weird compared to geographic topography. Whereas in this case, the network topography here and the geographic topography are like sort of bear no resemblance to each other whatsoever. And this is something you could see happening where if someone knew that there were folks on U.S. soil, even U.S. citizens communicating, and they wanted to sort of perpetrate or listen to what they're saying and collect everything they're doing, if they popped it out of the U.S. for a moment, they could turn on this equipment and be able to collect this stuff. And I should say, while the Renesas blog here claims or argues heavily that this is what they would call an adversarial route announcement, there's a lot of questions about whether or not this was just a fat finger, someone accidentally globally announcing a route that they shouldn't have. The second thing that you have to be aware of, and obviously most of you are that operate this kind of equipment, is that even within your autonomous system, within your network, or within your data center, you may not be the only one there. And so what we've seen is there's programs like Muscular, which I should have actually put this slide here first, where they were specifically attacking traffic between and within data centers for Google and Yahoo to collect full take data, including social graph data, sort of all your address book information, which is extremely important to the intelligence community to sort of understand who you're communicating with. Anyway, and so this was something revealed by Barton Gellman and Ashkan Soltani, and they're essentially saying, given some of the materials they're looking at here, that the NSA and the British intelligence group, the Global Communications Headquarters, are essentially copying entire data flows across these fiber optic cables. And they specifically named Google and Yahoo, but you can be sure that anyone else with a complicated data center, the infrastructure is going to face the same threats. And so now those links are increasingly being encrypted in some way that I don't know anything about because they haven't disclosed that. But anyway, I think I'll stop there and save the time for everyone else. Thanks.
Right, so I'm going to talk about relatively new technology called software-defined exchange points. And I'm going to make a point of how this is going to change the way we look at interconnections and the way we look at peering. So Joe explained the hierarchical structure of the internet, and that was the classic view of the internet. But recently, with the introduction of these video content and the overemphasis on the video content and technologies, it has resulted in creation of hypergiants, that is like CDNs and content providers. So rather than a hierarchical structure, the one we love, we see these hypergiants trying to peer with as many networks as possible and at as many locations as possible. So this is resulting in this results in changing the internet or the interdomain ecosystem. We have now a flatter and densely interconnected internet. So the interdomain ecosystem is actually evolving with the growing demand and the changes. But the underlying routing protocol, that is the Border Gateway Protocol or BGP, it is not. So the capabilities which BGP provides us is like you can still do the routing based on the destination IP prefixes. So it's not possible to do customization based on the nature of application. you can only influence your immediate neighbor, so it's not possible to remotely influence your path selection. And then you get an indirect control over data plane forwarding. I'm pretty sure nobody here configured BGP routers, but if you did, like, it's very painful to have those indirect configurations in the router, and then you make changes in the control plane, that change reflects in the data plane, you don't know what will happen, things are beyond your control. So we want to overcome the limitations of BGP, and this has been a topic of research for a lot of years, but now with the advances in the other field of networking, which is software-defined networking, it is possible to apply SDN for the border gateway protocols. So why SDN makes sense for interdomain routing? Because now SDN allows you to make forwarding decisions based on multiple header fields. So you're not just limited to make routing decisions based on just destination IP prefixes, but you can make routing decisions on multiple header fields. It gives you an ability to control the entire network with a single software program. So rather than writing hacky scripts, which are specific to particular devices in your network, you can write one single software program which controls and which applies your policies across the network. And then it also gives you direct control over the data plane. So as I said, like, rather than writing those configuration scripts of BGP, which indirectly influence the path selection, now you can directly control how you want to steer the traffic across the network. So SDN is really good, but we cannot just go out and say, like, let's replace everything with BGP and like replace it with SDN. So we have to figure out a way in which we can deploy or implement this thing in a more incrementally deployable manner. So the way we can do it is that we can deploy SDN, or we can start with this deployment, we can start with this movement by deploying SDN at the exchange points. And I said exchange points because exchange points provide us a significant leverage, that if you're able to make any changes at one single exchange point, it's going to influence or provide benefits to hundreds of other participants that are present at one exchange point. And as we know, everybody knows here, like, exchange points are currently the innovation hotbed. There are a lot of peering tussles going on. So they themselves have incentives to innovate and improve the way they provide the interconnection services. And recently, there has been a significant growth in the number of exchange points which have been developed. I'm sure Jane is going to talk more about, like, what is the nature of the growth of exchange points. So before I talk more about, like, what SDX can enable or how SDX can change the way we do peering, I want to give a brief overview of, like, what physically an exchange point means. So at any typical exchange point, we have a switching fabric. There are a bunch of networks who decide that we want to exchange traffic with each other. They have their border routers at those locations, and they create a BGP session, exchange routes, and then exchange traffic using those BGP sessions. So as the number of participants at the exchange point grew over a period of time, for example, exchange points like AM6 and DESX like have 700 or 800 participants, it was not possible to have this mesh of BGP peering sessions with each other. So they came up with a solution that let's have something called route server. So rather than like having one-to-one BGP peering session, they can have BGP peering session with one route server. So with this context, I want to explain what SDX here means. So when we talk about SDX, we basically talk about an SDX controller, which subsumes the behavior of route server. So now the participants at the SDX or the exchange point are not just exchanging BGP routes with each other, but they're also exchanging or sharing their SDN policy which they want to implement in the data plane. And then we'll replace the traditional layer 2 switch with an SDN switch, which allows us to match on multiple header fields. So now let's talk about like what SDX or how SDX can play a role in changing the way we think about interconnections. So SDX can actually enable flexible business relationship. So a lot of us here kind of resonate with the fact that given the evolving nature of the interdomain ecosystem, there is a demand from the network operators desiring, like, they want to have the ability to peer or make peering decisions based on time of day, nature of application, or volume of traffic. And with traditional networks or traditional BGP protocol, it's very hard to make those fine-grained peering decisions. So some of the use cases for this flexible business relationship can be, say, for example, Princeton sees performance degradation during the peak hours. So it can decide to peer with some other network or some other ISP for only the video traffic or the HTTP traffic during the peak hours. The other example can be some gaming services like Riot Games, and they can choose two different paths or routing paths with two different kind of characteristics. One with which is very latency sensitive, but it is expensive, but the other is like high volume, but it is cheaper. So like for the same gaming service, there can be two types of routing paths they can choose, and like they can select which application or which type of services should be going via which routing path. So because SDX can support fine-grained policies and programmability, so these peering, like these programmable peering policies are, or SDX can be an enabler, or like it can enable these kind of programmable peering policies at the exchange point. So security is another interesting use case where SDX can play an important role. So the desired nature is that we want to have the ability to detect and mitigate DDoS attacks, say prevent route hijacks, and also enable avoidance routing. So these are the things which are like highly desired. Some of the use cases in that case is like, say for example, Princeton University identifies, like they have an IPS box here, they identified that this is the source which is sending some DDoS attack traffic. They can block this rule at a much finer level of granularity upstream at the exchange point itself. The other use case can be that some government agencies, maybe not US, can remotely specify the routes to avoid surveillance for specific. So they might have some sensitive applications running which they don't want to route via countries which are like, which have the history of surveillance. So they can avoid those routes by specifying what routes they want to choose. So an important note which I want to make here is that why SDX, why exchange points make a significant impact in the security applications is that the strategic vantage point which they provide. So because like a lot of routing traffic, or a lot of traffic which goes on in the internet goes via these exchange points. So the strategic location of exchange point enables or makes the security application on top of its exchange point more potent. So another topic which I want to cover is about how to incentivize interconnections. And we did a study in African subcontinent 2 years back, and we observed that there were like a lot of participants which were either not peering or present at the local exchange points. And the other thing we observed was like even though they were present at the local exchange point, they had no incentives to peer with each other. So the goal is that can we use this new technology called SDX, use in the developing regions, and incentivize those participants to peer with each other. So the way I see it, SDX role here can be like it can provide additional incentives to peer at local exchange points for the network operators. So one of the goal, like one of the observation we made was that, say for example, in Kenya, so we were looking at the traffic going from South Africa to Kenya, and intuitively because these are like geographically neighboring countries, we would expect a shorter low latency path between the two. But what we observed was that the traffic was going all the way in Europe, Amsterdam, and then coming back to Kenya. So the gist behind that was that most of the content in these regions is actually hosted in European countries or US. So they have little or less incentives to actually peer with each other because there is not much of content within the local region, right? So the role SDX can actually play here is that it can enable in-path caching technologies like in-path caching, or it can enable packet deduplication, which can incentivize or like people to peer at the exchange point, get the caching data, get the packet deduplication data, and lower the operational costs. So this is one of the role in which SDX can actually incentivize networks to peer at the exchange point. Some of the ongoing efforts in this direction is that one of the challenge for us was to make sure that whatever we talk about SDX should not require hardware or switches which are not like either very expensive or like they do not exist. So we did an extensive research to figure out like what are the fundamental challenges in making sure that it can be supported in commodity switches. So we have a separate paper on that. I can talk more about it offline. But what we did is that we enabled that all these fancy techniques we're talking about, all these fancy applications we're talking about can be actually supported in cheaper commodity switches. So that drives us to like explore the places where we can actually go out and deploy SDX. One of the location or one of the deployment which we're actively working on is a small exchange point in Southeast Asia. And for them, the biggest motivation is that like because SDX enables more applications which can create more revenue generating opportunities for the local ISPs. So they are incentivized that, okay, we should create an exchange point, but we should also make sure that it is a software defined exchange point. So before I end, I just want to give you, make sure that you have these two takeaways. One is that the interdomain ecosystem is actually evolving. So there are every day there are these new challenges of content delivery. And over a period of time, the exchange point, because of their strategic location, because of ability to have this software-defined exchange point concept, there is an increasing exchange for exchange points. And SDX can actually be enabler, or it can expedite this innovation because it provides new capabilities and abstraction. It enables new applications which were either impossible or hard to do in the traditional network. it provides more incentives for networks to peer at the exchange point because it provides these network operators more control. It gives performance benefits, and at the same time, it also enables security. So with that, I will end this and let Jane talk about her.
Good morning. My name is Jane Coffin. I work for an organization called the Internet Society. Some of you may or may not know it, but for those of you that do work with the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, RFCs for the Internet standards, we're the organizational home of the IETF. We do not have any influence on what they do. We just help pay for what they do and organize it. It's an important institution for many of you that do work on Internet standards. But ISOC also, the Internet Society, does a lot of work around the world, both in the policy, technology, and the development domain. What I'm going to speak about today very quickly, so we can get to the discussion, are the wireless for community networking projects we're working on, Internet Exchange Point projects. So think of where we are today and go back. In some countries, we're talking about 3 to 4 peers at an IX, donated equipment. It's a startup phase for an Internet Exchange Point, same with the wireless projects. There's more information on our website, which is internetsociety.org, if you're interested in more of what we do. Hang on. So some advertising. This is our mission. We've been around for about 25 years. Vint Cerf, Bob Kahn, Larry Landweber, some of the luminaries of the internet helped create the Internet Society. And from the very beginning, we're interested in making sure that we were promoting the development of the internet in other countries. Of course, policy comes along with that type of infrastructure development, but it's not the going-in mode in certain developing countries. For example, I was in Kyrgyzstan in November. We had been in there in May as well. We have a report out on developing the infrastructure there. I used to actually live in the former Soviet Republic, so I know the difficulty of going into a country like that. But there's a very receptive government at this point, but you don't come in talking about Snowden and surveillance. Tricky. What you do come in and talk about is how we can work as a community there. We have local chapters as well, which are bottom-up community-based organizations, roughly associated with us. There are about 115 of them around the world. So we've just developed an Internet Society chapter. I took Curtis Lindquist, who used to be the CEO of NetNode, one of the top IXPs in Europe, with us to do training because we've all mentioned BGP, Border Gateway Protocol, incredibly important for moving your traffic across the internet. But also if you're peering at an exchange point, you do need to know how to use BGP. We've seen some IXs, particularly in Nigeria, and went in to do a networking class there that we're running, advertising the entire routing table. That's a little tricky if you're trying to peer and exchange traffic efficiently and effectively. So what we do is go into places where people want us to go. It's not as if we try and force ourselves. You've got to try and build up that bottom-up community, so that's part of what we do. Back to the IXPs and wireless for communities. How do we do what we do? As I've mentioned, we just don't jump into a country or a meeting. We work with partners, and this is very critical. There are some in the room, actually. Comcast has been a good partner of ours in Paraguay and Bolivia, the only landlocked countries in South America. Part of that work is to try and develop, again, technical capacity, human and physical, and that ecosystem of people to support it. Some of our other partners are the Digital Empowerment Foundation, an excellent group of people in India, Pakistan, Nepal, working on very basic community wireless mesh networks. Everything from going to junkyards, getting metal, and putting arrays together through that type of work. Very bottom up, and builds that sustainable buy-in from a community when you're part of the build-up from the bottom up. Cisco helps donate equipment, as does Alcatel. We are not specific to US manufacturers, just want to make that clear. We're a global organization, nonprofit, teams around the world, about 83 staff, speaking about 30 languages. We do some of our work through grants. IXP Toolkit grant was from Google. This helped us scale up IXPs and develop them and develop capacity. Comcast grant again, Bolivia and Paraguay. But we work with the regional internet registries and others, ICANN. We took them to a high mountain village in Montenegro and had them talk about the DNS. That was fascinating. About 8 feet of snow, I felt like. But it was great. And we were working with the university there. So what we do try and do also is partner with universities where we can, which is why I know Nick and Arpit. It helps to put a human face on things. People do help us do what we do and what makes the internet run, right? Technology is fabulous, but it doesn't walk around by itself, and BGP doesn't work by itself. So the far, my left, your right, I believe, is Machuki Mwangi. He's one of the best experts in Africa on internet exchange point development, networking, and other. He's one of our team. He's standing next to what was the Kenyan IXP, the first incarnation. So we talked about switches, right? There's a switch in among the rack here, and boxes and wires. So an IXP is equipment, right? But what we often say, and Philip Smith, who's one of the gods of the internet as far as IXP development goes, it's 80% human engineering, 20% technical. We had the gear, we could set one up here today, run some traffic, see what the bits would flow. But the problem here is that if you don't have the peers coming together, you've got to convince them it's a good idea. We spend a lot of time convincing people that peering is a much more efficient way to go. It does, of course, help if you're a small ISP competing in what was a strong incumbent market. So back to Kevin's point, we're talking about things that maybe were easy to talk about here in the United States. Okay, you're supposed to interconnect, 20 years ago? Think new. Right? Or not new, but new different, and it's definitely a challenge. A lot of the incumbents will not peer at a small IX because they think traffic levels will drop. Quite frankly, what we've seen is the traffic levels go back up. And it's more efficient to peer at an IX because you don't have to negotiate all those arrangements with each ISP. You come together. It depends on the peering policy as well. At the IX, most of them are open, and we encourage bottom-up IXP community development. This is not the commercial side, but we do work closely with commercial IXs as well. Bottom line, they don't need to be expensive. We've heard wild estimates of 500,000. We work closely with the World Bank to try and encourage them not to suggest that. They're great partners, but it doesn't take a $50,000 switch. You can come in at about 30 to 50. We often help donate that equipment, and this is, again, the startup phase of an IX. Some countries, they're just trying to keep running. The technical experts have other jobs. This is their voluntary job. IXs will grow to have staff and better interconnect, but it takes some marketing and some outreach. Links, you were talking about ASNs earlier. Autonomous system numbers are administered by the regional internet registries around the world. Links, which is the London Exchange, started out with 5 ISPs and donated equipment. I had to write this on my hand. I looked at it just a minute ago. They're running, there are 673 ASNs showing up now in London. That's huge, 5 to 673. So what we often will say to our counterparts is, hang tight, your market's gonna grow, but think about Africa alone, 54 countries. Some in Middle Africa, really not in a phase where we can go in and help them, like the Central African Republic. It's a bit tricky on the political side. But we've been asked by the African Union to go into Chad. We've run about 60 workshops in Africa in the last 3 to 5 years. Best practices on internet exchange point development, beginning BGP, and then more technical BGP and technical networking. It's about a 3 to 5 day course. We get the engineers, the traffic exchange managers from the ISPs together to try and improve the traffic exchange environment. It's a bottom-up community, technical capacity building, and as you all probably know, but it's very important in a developing country, Kenya was running their traffic, the majority of the traffic through London before. Now they're exchanging traffic at KXP, as Arpit had mentioned. Machuki used to run it. The 2 gals here are in Lesotho, and we helped start up that IXP. Bottom of the slide here is my VP, Raul Echeverria, who used to run the LACNIC, which is the Regional Internet Registry in Latin America. And he's giving an award to Bevel Wooding, who is Packet Clearinghouse's sort of man in the Caribbean who does more to develop IXPs there than I've ever seen. Complicated environment, old monopoly incumbents, submarine cable, like backhaul from the landing station, is pretty much non-existent as far as from a competitive level. So if you're looking at our situation years ago, a lot of what we found, and I used to work for AT&T and NTIA, so I was government and industry, you do find that some of what we had happen in the United States, Europe, and other highly applicable to looking at best practices and going in and speaking with countries, so that's what we try and do. We are looking at examining more closely route views, so prefixes, ASNs in Africa. We're doing this by deploying servers and IXPs. Some code is being written for us by a university in Spain. Again, small stuff, but it's not the biggest IXPs in the world. But what we're trying to do is cultivate the environment that many of you already have of looking at routes, examining traffic, looking at where you can create more efficiencies. So many IXPs, because they are startups and or in their mid phase of starting up, they don't have the time and energy. If we can go in and help them and work with them to deploy those servers. We're also working with RIPE NCC, a regional internet registry in Europe, that helps deploy probes to look at traffic. Now, the challenge of Snowden has made it very complicated for us to do our jobs. The project we were working on in Bolivia was deploying Raspberry Pis to take a look at the environment pre-IXP to measure. You need to know what it looked like before so you can note the impact after of an IXP. They thought the Raspberry Pis were spy devices. We had to work with the ministry. The minister changed 3 times. So if you think you're going into a country and magically the internet's gonna, we're gonna bring some boxes and wires in, fix everything up, get everyone trained up, it takes some time. I often have to explain, we're starting over. And people often look at me and say, well, why? What happened? I said, the political environment can dictate your internet. Another thing I would throw out for you is that we assume you can get equipment into a country. Server sent to Uganda to help monitor the network, sitting in customs since November. $10,000 paid to the Egyptian officials to get switches out of jail. I call it jail, customs jail. Sometimes it's customs duties, other times it's taxes. God knows what those taxes really are sometimes, but I often say to government officials around the world, trying to grow the internet, half of it's sitting in customs. So let's release it, let's get some things going so we can actually do something. I'm a lot gentler when I do that. But in any event, the idea is to try and grow that African environment of taking a look at analysis and measurement. Same thing's going on in Latin America, as I mentioned. I just want to give you some idea of what an IX can do or better appearing in a country. In Ecuador, it was $100 per megabit per second. Before the IX was established, it went down to $1. They were, of course, running the traffic through NAPA of the Americas in Miami. Sometimes we're not popular with long-haul traffic providers because we are promoting local internet infrastructure development. So it's a delicate dance, yeah? Another fact to just throw out for you, this is Africa-related, is that we are often approached by companies in a neutral manner to say, hey, we're thinking about going into a market. How many IXs in Africa are running 10 gigs of traffic? And we said, well, what are you thinking? Are you going to use all 10 gigs? Because there may be 4. And these are not the commercial exchanges. They're running terabits of traffic, right? But some of the basic IXs, basic connectivity, maybe 500 megabits. Malawi put in the Google cache and went from 500 megabits up to 800 in about 3 weeks, and now they're running over a gig of traffic. That's a lot. The banks actually peer at the IX because the IX is providing more consistent traffic management and efficiencies. So think about a basic ecosystem developing and how that works, and we're just trying to help amplify that. There's a paper Hernan Galperin from the University of San Andres has done. We have a lot of other resources at the back of this slide deck. Don't get scared, they're about 25 slides. I'm not going to talk about them, but they're there for you to take a look at if you're interested in some studies that have been done. I would note that from an efficiencies perspective, when we did do a study on Nigeria and Kenya, and it's again at the back, the IX in Kenya, they were running traffic at about 300 megabits per second. IX traffic peering down to 3 seconds. So there is a huge impact. It's better efficiencies of traffic management, lower cost, better quality of service. It starts to boost the local economy to use that infrastructure again. It's trust in the infrastructure. So businesses do start up. So there's that economic impact from a different level. So again, what we're doing with IXPs, and I didn't talk as much about wireless for communities, but it's a community multiplier effect. Fiber and internet infrastructure development, it's not just wireless on that side. You need the wire line. Local tech community development, network operator group. On my computer here, you can see something called PHNOG, the Philippines Network Operator Group. We help develop these network operator groups around the world to form local ecosystems of experts who can talk to each other and train each other. Mentoring opportunities, you cannot diminish the effect of a train the trainer program. What we've seen in India on the wireless community side, we We started to train local experts who trained each other. Now they've got a whole ecosystem going on, internet cafes, schools getting wired, people seeing economic development and using it for small business. For IXPs, some observations, these are just very broad. Obviously, peering allows ISPs to save costs. Transit versus peering ratio impacts an ISP's bottom line. So this is a business issue. For those of you that are big companies in the room, think these guys are just starting out, but they've got to understand the network efficiencies from an economic perspective. So we do try and come in and help bring that perspective as well. So that's it. And again, there's more data here, a little advertising, but it does show you that we're doing work around the world. We're trying to amplify that local environment, and what you knew is issues here for barriers to entry exist everywhere now still.
All right, thank you. Thank you all. All right, I want to ask a few questions to the group and then try and get some from all of you. You each talked about what we might call forcing factors. Joe, you talked about Snowden revelations, Arpit SDN from a technology standpoint, and Jane, you talked about IXPs and sort of more broadly the proliferation in the developing world. I'd like each of you to try and sort of run the clock forward. So what's the response in terms of the structure of interconnection markets, the performance of the internet? How does that evolve given the trends that you've each talked about, or one of the other ones? Yeah.
Sure, so really briefly, we've seen great response from the Snowden revelations in terms of people protecting things, increasing uses of forward secrecy for certain kinds of application layer traffic. I think the thing we haven't seen a lot of, or as much of, is sort of a kick in the pants for things like RPKI and BGP-Sec, ways to sort of better secure the routing itself. And I know, like, that's one question I have for Arpit is implications of SDX for security, but what about securing SDX itself? Like, that seems like, maybe that's trivial, but it seems hard to me, but maybe it's because I don't know what I'm talking about. So I don't know if I have any sort of, I guess I'm pessimistic that there seem to be really, really difficult factors for maybe not RPKI, but BGP-Sec seems like there's a lot of challenges in doing stuff to, and maybe we don't need that, but I don't know. I guess is a way of saying it.
So I think to answer your question about the SDX security, I think yes, it's a very valid concern because. Or SDX, or in general, if I talk about the exchange point itself, I think there is already a concern that what if some surveillance techniques are already deployed in the exchange point. I think one of the advantage exchange points, or at least these big exchange points provide, is the transparency in some sense, because they're in public domain. So they do provide, so whatever they do is more in the public view rather than putting a tap in some data center links between Google, Google data centers. So I think because of this public view of exchange points, I think surveillance in general is hard to do. The other point about the security, or the single point of failure, I think there are a lot of techniques which have been, some of them we have been working on in terms of say for example, somebody comes in and say I want to write a rule to drop all the traffic that's going to Google, right? Mm-hmm. So I think we're working on mechanisms in which these kind of nasty policies can be stopped from being pushed down in the SDX. Mm-hmm. So there is some work required, but I think it's people have realized that and they're working in that direction.
That sounds like fun.
And let me just ask you a follow-up, then I'll get to James. So more broadly, with regard to SDX or SDNs in general, how do those charts of the structure of the interconnection marketplace change as we get much more software-defined networking across the board?
Depending on the market, you're going to scale up the amount of traffic coming into a country. You're going to see more data center development and more companies relying on that content and growing local content. So you're going to see an ecosystem develop there, but likely more international traffic flows interconnected as well when they start to scale up their technical expertise. One thing I would note is that we have a routing resilience manifesto out. It's called Manners, M-A-N-R-S, and this is through a colleague of mine, Andrei Robichevsky, who used to work for RIPE NCC, and it's under Olaf Kalkman, who worked for NL Labs, DNSSEC land in the Netherlands. Olaf is our CITO, and I think he might be a great person to come speak in October, because we have a public encryption, an encryption program going right now, and security. But the Manners program is to talk about routing security and working with internet service providers around the world to try and secure routing a bit more, as well as BGP-Sec and others.
And it's mutually agreed norms for routing security? Is that the Manners?
Yeah.
That is awesome.
Yeah. So take a look at it. I can give you the data later, but It's an attempt to try and bring folks together. We're also strong advocates of open encryption standards, which are being worked on right now in the IETF. If any of you are interested, the IETF is open. You can go online, join an RFC group, which is the standards development process, and we have scholarships to take people to meetings like that. So just because you're living in the US doesn't mean you can't benefit from that.
But just getting beyond the security issues and the surveillance issues, how does the marketplace change as you get more IXPs and more SDN type technologies proliferated out?
So I think, like as Jen kind of pointed out, it's about the fact it's not just about like one exchange point or one switch. It's about the ecosystem which evolves around the exchange point setup, right? So for example, if you look at the large exchange points like Links and AM6, they started small, but because people realize that they can save money if they start peering at these exchange points, then like this ecosystem of like setting up data centers, setting up more, like hosting more content started. I think this is the trend which we have observed. So she pointed about the Kenya thing. So when we were doing the study, we observed that there was a lot of tromboning happening between traffic going in and out of Kenya. But since like the exchange point, the Kenya exchange point was set up, like this ecosystem started developing. Earlier, the Kenyan content was actually hosted in Europe, but then it gets started hosting in the Kenyan area itself, and that saves a lot. Like it's basically a chicken egg problem. Like something has to come first. So SDN and exchange point can be a harbinger of like how things can change over a period of time.
The other aspect I would highlight is that you had mentioned earlier, one of us, I think, or you, Kevin, hosting websites in countries right now. I'll give you an example of Rwanda not being done as much. We're working on a project with the Rwandan government to try and bring back 10,000 websites to be hosted in Rwanda. Again, you're growing that content management system, the data centers, to Arpit's point as well. That starts to build a different technical system in the country of experts and people and businesses, but it takes some time for that to happen. I mean, something as simple as 24/7 service and customer service at some data centers in parts of the world, not right there yet. So that's another thing to take a look at as far as an environment goes.
All right, so let me ask about a couple things that we didn't touch on, and then I'm mindful of the time for the panel and want to give everyone else a chance too. So one thing that none of you really talked about specifically is video, which is mentioned in the introduction to the conference, that there has, of course, been this proliferation of video. So, how does that play into the developments that you're talking about? How will that influence going forward the way this environment looks?
Well, Arpit, you did sort of hint on the Riot game. I don't know, is that
the Riot example? Yeah,
is that
right.
a type of game?
So Riot Games is basically a game service provider.
League of Legends,
Yeah.
yes.
It's a company based in LA, and they gave a talk in OpenIX last year, and they highlighted the exact same problem I was talking about, that they have these gaming services in which like part of it is the video, which people are looking at. The other part is like the interactive session, which is between the gaming services. So they want to have like different kind of paths, one in which they pay less, and like video streaming or video traffic goes over that, but the other interactive, they want more control over the data part, and they were interested like can SDX or these programmable exchange points can play a role in making sure that they have better control over the interactive sessions.
Yeah, and it sounds like you can think of that as like signaling versus content, right? When we do other kinds of high bandwidth communications, and the thing I think about is streaming video may be the current, load that people really worry about, but in DC, and maybe it's just specific to DC, I can't tell you how many people I see when I get off work at like 8, 9 p.m. putting their kids to bed via FaceTime, which is, uncachable two-way HD video traffic. And like, if that becomes something that everyone does like for 2 or 3 hours a day, I don't know what the network looks like.
Well, if you have a teenager, then 2 or 3 hours a day is low. I can tell you about my daughter, but yeah, okay.
That's so many bits, man.
So I'm going to throw out a term that's floating around the international community and obviously here in the United States called over-the-top services, becoming a buzzword and a complication. Particularly, I was just in the Caribbean at a workshop. Yes, at a workshop, not. People always laugh when you say I was in the Caribbean for a workshop, but I was. Developing country, OTT is an evil word for some of the carriers. They don't want to see services. And I said, so who are your next customers? The next connected billion are children. I asked the room, how young is the youngest person in the room? Your child using an iPad 2.
Yeah.
And I went, oh. So if the connected generation are children, and children are streaming videos and watching movies, that's your generation. I mean, Asia is way ahead of us on the content streaming delivery, quite frankly. A colleague of mine who runs our Asia bureau, it's a huge issue. And especially where there aren't robust networks to carry that capacity, you've got it's almost like a jump start or a heart attack for the regulator at times. Because some regulators don't obviously understand technology, and they're trying to accommodate the incumbents, figure out a way to slow it down so people make money, and you feel like saying you can't apply the old telco regulatory rubric to the internet. The traffic doesn't flow the same way, but they are still trying to stop packets at the border, and so that's something interesting.
Yeah, what's interesting about this discussion is even when we talk about video, we've talked about several different kinds of traffic. So there's mass video where you can cache it. There's this two-way video, and then Arpit, you're talking about the game traffic it's not high bandwidth, but it's very low latency is really what's important. So in order to accommodate these kinds of uses, do we have to go to a more and more application-specific world? And if so, how does that play in with the whole open internet process and the kind of resistance of the regulators to those kinds of moves?
So, yeah, I think like that's a tricky one.
Yeah, I'm sure some of the other panels will get to this too, yeah.
So I think like if I go a bit backward, right, I think the way I see this thing, the trend here is like usually the driving force is money, right? So the growth of video is happening, and people started paying a lot of money because they were not peering and they were connected with their providers. They realized if they connect with Exchange Point, they can save some money, right? So that was the first driving point. But I think like this results in a better interconnected internet or interdomain ecosystem now, and that can actually support additional services on top of it. So application-specific peering, I think like if you prioritize or if you treat it something different, I think like it basically falls in a category where we don't know how to answer that question. But I think like technology-wise, SDX can support it. I think like it's more of a community debate that whether we should be doing that or not.
All right, so one more question for me, and then I'll open it up to all of you, and then Nick will tell us when we have to stop. So Nick alluded to the next conference likely being about Internet of Things, and so that's one of the pieces I want to ask about that we haven't discussed. How does that play in, given we're talking about now these billions and trillions of devices connected to the network? What does that mean for interconnect?
I
think you're going to see governments starting to realize that they need to open up their thinking to new technologies that will help with better efficiencies for traffic, because it is about content. It really is, and whether it's real time or cached, two-way, other, it's creating lots of drama in some countries. Seriously, I mean, I think you saw that the head of WhatsApp in Brazil was arrested last week. So he's been let out of jail. But around Christmas time, the Brazilian government also tried to shut down WhatsApp. Many of the content users immediately went to another service in the Caribbean. About 200,000 people uploaded the app in about an hour. Now, of course, the site didn't go down, thankfully, but you are looking at consumers driving certain policies. Then that may be in India, the same thing. We've looked at what's gone on with Facebook there. We're a keen advocate of what they're doing in many parts of the world, and so I think some of that debate was wildly spun out of context. I mean, should North Americans and Europeans be dictating how Indians get their service? 50% more packages for service from the ISPs were uptaken in India as a result of some of their work, the ability to use free basics. So it's fascinating to see that content and the technology debate. We're sitting here in a room and 90% of you know way more about how traffic works than I do, perhaps. I know a lot about the architecture, but we're seeing this debate being driven to a higher level and the need to explain technology better. The UN had their Sustainable Development Goals reboot, I should say, in October this year, and the internet appeared in one of their 17 deliverables as an important thing to support poverty alleviation, better water source or resource management, things like that. So we were in there jumping up and down about the internet, basically saying, like, the internet's important, and they were like, it enables things, right? And we're like, yeah, it does. So talking about infrastructure and technology is important, and figuring out a way to reach some of the regulators. I usually go in and say, do you want to get reelected? Do you want a happier population? And do you want a better economy? And you go, yes. Okay. So then we start with that. But it's a layering effect of discussing technology and the impact.
Yeah, and I'd actually be very DC and respond with the question that you, I shouldn't expect you to answer. Someone like Nick maybe can answer, which is I think network function virtualization in the Internet of Things has a bigger sort of implication for interconnection than and I don't know the answer to that stuff because I don't know anything about it, but that does seem to be.
Yeah, I think I can briefly
Cool.
answer that. So basically, I think when we look at Internet of Things, it's about the explosion of too much of data going from one place to another, mostly houses to some data centers, right? I think this is where like the in-path network function, like applying in-path network functions become important. And like we need to know that what kind of traffic, like on what kind of traffic this network function has to be applied. And this is where SDX can actually play an important role, that you can write policies specifying that like, okay, this is Nest traffic, and I want to process it here itself rather than sending all the way to some other country location.
And that gets to the application specific stuff too. Neat. Cool.
All right, can we do a few minutes for Q&A? Okay, 3-4 minutes, go.
On SDN, you know, did you think about how CDNs evolve, internet, and so forth, with adaptive routing? How do you look at the capability of adaptive routing picking paths based on performance of the industries versus SDNs? Is it similarities?
So there are
You may
definitely.
want to repeat the question for the internet.
So I think your question is more about like CDNs basically apply different logics to decide different paths for delivering their content, and how does it relate with SDX, right? So it does closely relate with what SDX can do. And I think like CDNs are one big entity, and like if you have to be part of that CDN to leverage those capabilities of like applying those logics and like figuring out what path to choose. I think SDX basically lowers the threshold of participation, that you can manage your own network, you can remotely write those policies at the remote exchange point, saying like, I want my traffic to be treated this way.
But yeah, I think I just want to get as many people as possible. Go.
So like, okay, I think we can check out.
Okay. Yes, and
So I was a bit surprised that the word power never stood out.
The word what? Power?
Power.
Like-
I mean, 60 to 70% of cell towers in places like India run on diesel generators.
Yeah.
And getting like stable power, I mean, the amount of power you need to run like even I mean, for a long time, countries like India didn't have a data center because of lack of stable power. I mean, and if you're setting up a data center, you're essentially asking the power budget of sort of a weekly working nuclear power plant, right? And if I build a nuclear power plant, I might also use that power to first give it to the population. So what types of obstacles have you faced with respect to power? What do you see power going forward? Is it going to be a solved problem? Is it going to be an unsolved problem? Is it going to be oil?
So let me repeat the question for the webcast. It was a question about power and why it hadn't come up. It's a really important question. And it's one where we've donated generators, solar panels, and other types of alternative energy for IXPs themselves, actually Armenia. Usha Edie, which is famous for the app, for crowdsourcing app that was used in the election in Kenya and also in the earthquake in Haiti to find people. They've developed something called BRCK Brick. It's a rural power solution. We're going to try and test that out in some countries to see whether that's optimal. But right now in some developing countries, you're actually seeing massive solar energy projects coming up, wind projects that are more innovative than what we're seeing here. And in countries where the sun is commodity, right? And I'm not joking, it's something we've seen in Nepal as well, of where do you come up with an alternative energy solution? And there are creative solutions to it, but it's a good question. It's going to put, well, what I hope it does do is that government agencies start talking to each other. In many countries, they're separate fiefdoms. And so when you don't have government officials speaking across to each other to develop a country's infrastructure, you run into issues. And so what will happen is it's like what I call a forklift upgrade if you're looking at a network development, right? If you haven't leveled up on what you need, you might have to pay a lot more at the end of the day. So if you start thinking about that, it's something that we obviously have to do with our IX colleagues to think about for the long run for sustainability.
And there are some efforts at IETF to do intermittent routing kinds of things where you may not have a connection to the other side. And that may help in terms of mitigating some of the loss of power to across IXs and other kinds of things. But yeah, it's a real serious problem. Yeah.
Well, some of the switches that we look at sending to certain countries, we make sure that they're not going to be a massive. I mean, some companies try and offload, I'll just be honest, old switches, which could heat up a room, quite frankly. And so we have to be very sensitive to the fact that, and warn people. And so that's why some IXs actually develop first in universities and then shift over to data centers or other company facilities that are neutral because they can't afford the power. So if we do work with the university has a power supply usually from the town or the government. So it's something we can start up there, but it's a good point.
Okay, one more question in the back, and then
I'm talking about the developing countries where maybe the government, the private sector already have some of this connection, but we're talking about some remote area, poor area, underdeveloped area that maybe only $2 per day income. How do you approach this kind of, in order to provide them broadband service so that they can do tele-education where there is no teacher or telemedicine where there is no doctor? Would you please, how do we start structurally, strategically, or economically?
Sure, that's a good question. Sure, sorry. There was a question about how to start up, whether I would say it's IXP or wireless community development or just broadband development in a developing country where you might be looking at incomes of $2 a day. I know in the Philippines they're looking right now at a Wi-Fi project across some of the islands. We're working with the government is working on that. We've been helping with an IX development, a minor role. But to your point about, say, Nepal, where the income is very low, that was a community-based project where some of the technology was donated, but other pieces of technology were created in the country. So we did a train-the-trainer program in India that was similar to the one in Nepal because you want to take best practices. That was where local people, again, went to a junkyard, took scrap metal, put it together to create the antenna and the array. No joke. So, I mean, but what you're doing is you're taking innovation and bringing it to a level that can be replicated. That's the key thing. And so that replication and that work in a developing country and sort of amplification from outsiders, you don't want to give them too much that's free, right, so they can't afford it later. That's actually something that's being done right now at a really sophisticated level in Catalan in Spain. We just had a call with some fellows that we're working with. They're taking grants, but they're making money back on a community-based commons wireless network. So that's something that is manageable and doable, and there's some good best practices, and we can provide those to you.
all right, thank you all for a great job.